For 3 years, beginning in 2013, the west of Africa suffered the biggest outbreak of the Ebola virus in history. It mostly affected Sierra Leone, Liberia and Guinea. In total, 28,500 people were infected and over 11,000 people died. The disease is highly contagious, and at the time there was no known cure. The mortality rate is also extremely high at 40%. In other words, if you get Ebola, the chances of you dying are not much better than 50-50. How would you feel if you were told that you had inadvertently been in contact with someone who was carrying the disease? What would Jesus do if he met someone with a deadly, highly contagious disease that left people scared to go anywhere near them? Well, we find the answer in Luke 5, 12 through 16. And we're going to look at these verses under two headings. Firstly, saying that Jesus cures the incurable. Jesus cures the incurable. Imagine finding out that not only had you been in contact with someone who had had Ebola, but that you had contracted it yourself. All your hopes and dreams for the future would be hanging by a thread. Well, that's what it was like to have leprosy in the first century and in many other centuries. Even today, according to the leprosy mission, the disease sees entire families having their job, education, and marriage prospects destroyed. It's widely accepted that the word for leprosy in the Bible is used to cover a range of different skin diseases. In fact, it even covers things like mold in houses. We were thinking last week about how flexible the word for tree or wood could be, and it's the same with the word for leprosy. But certainly it seems to include modern day leprosy. Leprosy leaves people horribly disfigured, but the leprosy itself isn't actually what causes the disfigurement. Instead, the disease destroys the body's warning system to pain. It damages the small nerves on the skin's surface so that the victim doesn't notice burns, ulcers, and other injuries. And these then lead to permanent disabilities. Many go blind because they can't feel grit when it gets into their eyes, and so they don't know to poke it out. Damage due to loss of sensation can leave victims with clawed fingers and toes. In third world countries, you can get rats chewing on sleeping lepers without them even knowing it. It is often described as a living death. And here in verse 12, this man hadn't just got leprosy recently, his body was full of it. He perhaps hadn't been able to feel anything for years, and his body would have been mutilated from head to foot, literally rotting away. And as I say, it was a living death. In fact, one Jewish historian says that lepers were treated as if they were, in effect, dead men. They were isolated from the rest of society. They had to live by themselves, away from everyone else. And people generally assumed that leprosy was God's curse against sin. So they were religious outsiders as well as social outsiders. And this man realizes how serious a position he's in. To have leprosy wasn't so much to have contracted an illness as to have been handed a death sentence. And a slow, painful, long drawn out death sentence at that. So no wonder in verse 12 he falls on his face and begs. This is a dead man walking. To even have emerged from his leper colony and come up to a healthy person like Jesus would have been a huge risk. In fact, some Bible versions capture this with the word behold in verse 12. Behold, a man full of leprosy. It's shocking. People with leprosy weren't just walking around in public. It wasn't something that you would see. but he knows that Jesus is his only hope. So we have here a living death, a disease which dulls our inbuilt warning system, which would otherwise stop us from doing the things that will eventually destroy us. A disease which separates us from God's people, separates us from God's worship. Does that ring any bells? We don't have to look too hard to see a deeper meaning to all this. From when leprosy is first mentioned in the Bible, there are hints that it's a picture of something deeper. Even as we read earlier from Leviticus, lepers needed a priest to pronounce them clean, not a doctor to describe them medicine. The priest had to make a sin offering to make atonement for the leper as part of the cleansing process. And without that sin offering, the leper would remain unfit to worship God in the tabernacle and continue to be cut off from God's presence. A dead man walking, much like Adam, outside the garden. In short, leprosy is a picture of sin. It's a picture of our natural attitude to God. God tells us what's good for us, and we ignore him, we do what's wrong, and it disfigures, it degrades, and eventually kills us. If you haven't yet trusted in Jesus, do you realize, as this man did, the seriousness of your condition? Do you realize that ignoring the Creator's instructions, which we've all done, will eventually kill you? Do you understand that this disease of sin is the reason that the world's in the state that it's in? Do you realize that it's so infectious, that it's not just the really bad people who have it, but everyone who has ever been born? Like physical leprosy, it doesn't always show itself right away, but it doesn't take long. And perhaps you're starting to realize it. Perhaps you're starting to realize that this disease has left you unclean. That no matter how much you try and block it out, your mind keeps going back to things you've said or done. Or there's an emptiness inside you, something gnawing away at you, and nothing and no one seems able to fill it. Well, if so, God in his kindness this morning is telling you why, and he's telling you that there's hope. He's telling you that sin doesn't have to dominate you forever. And as this man falls before Jesus, there's only one question on his mind. He has no doubt about Jesus' ability to heal him. But would Jesus be willing to? Perhaps his particular form of the disease is so ugly and revolting that Jesus won't want anything to do with him. Maybe you feel like that this morning. You have no doubt about Jesus' ability to save broken people in general, but you wonder if he could really save you. What you've done is so bad, or you've rejected him so often. There may be hope for others, but is there hope for you? You worry that it's too late. But look at Jesus' answer. This disease-ravaged man asks, "Lord, if you will." And Jesus says, "I will." Perhaps it seems too good to be true. As human beings, we have no problem believing in power, but we can struggle to believe that power and love go together. Look at all the pagan gods that people have come up with over the centuries. They dream up gods that can control the weather and crops and wars and so on. But they never imagine that those gods could love them. Or think of a little boy and his father. Children have no problem believing their dads can do anything. But then the little boy breaks a vase and he hides, because he's skeptical of his father's willingness to forgive him. But in Jesus we see both power and love. So if you're not a Christian today, it's not because Jesus doesn't have the power to save you, and it's not because he's not willing to save you. If you want to be clean, you can be. And in the leper, we have a wonderful example of what to do. You need to admit the seriousness of your position, that before a holy God you are unclean. Just picture the contrast between this man with his flesh literally rotting, standing before a healthy person like Jesus, and it pictures sin and purity. Before a holy God, we are all unclean. But you must believe too that Jesus can make you clean. And then you must throw yourself in his mercy, and you can be certain that he will make you clean. In a way, this leper was right to say, if you're willing, because there were many lepers in Israel that Jesus didn't heal. But if you're asking Jesus to save you, you don't have to say, if you're willing. You don't have to wonder, because he says, John 6:37, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. And by the way, the same is true if you're a Christian already. There are some things that we need to acknowledge might not be God's will for our lives. But there are other things, and he's told us that it's his will for us. For example, he tells us that his will is our sanctification. This is the will of God for you, your sanctification, or becoming more like Jesus. So if you're constantly giving in to temptation, that isn't God's will for your life. And if you are, don't blame him, don't blame your circumstances, don't blame your upbringing. He's both able and willing to help you die unto sin and live unto righteousness. You might never dream of doubting God's power, but don't doubt his willingness to help you either. And as you pray for people in this community, are you convinced both of God's ability and his willingness to save them and to cure the incurable? People we think of as incurable could come in different categories. There are those who feel themselves to be incurable, who think they're beyond anyone's help, even God's, who society looks down on and writes off. But Jesus came particularly for the outcasts and the rejects of society. But there are also those who seem incurable to us because they don't feel they need cured. They're good people. They go through life with apparently no awareness that they need cleansed and seem to have no interest in God. But Jesus can save them too, because Jesus cures the incurable. Let that shape your prayers this week. But then secondly, this morning, even more amazingly, we see that Jesus touches the untouchable. Jesus touches the untouchable. The most shocking thing about this whole story isn't Jesus stopping to talk to this leper, this man with his flesh rotting, who people would usually run from in terror. Nor is the most shocking thing that Jesus can completely cure a deadly disease. The most shocking thing about this story is that Jesus touches him. Look again at verse 13. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Until his death in 2003, Dr. Paul Brand was one of the key figures in the fight against leprosy. He pioneered medical techniques that are still used today. He was the son of missionary parents. He grew up in India. He trained to be a surgeon in England, and then he went back to India. And on one occasion, when he wasn't able to speak one of the local languages, he gave a leprosy patient a friendly pat to show that he'd do whatever he could for him. The patient immediately started to cry, and Dr. Brand asked a colleague what he'd done wrong, and she said, "You touched him, and no one has touched him for years." They're tears of joy. And it was the same in Jesus' day. Touching a leper just wasn't done. How quick would you be to touch someone who had Ebola? On top of that, according to their law, to touch a leper would leave you ceremonially unclean. Perhaps it was 20 or 30 years since this man had been touched by anyone. Maybe he had once known the touch of a wife or children, but no more. Imagine his longing for the touch of another human being. Imagine what it would be like to go year after year without a handshake, without a touch on the arm, without a hug. We know today that it's psychologically harmful not to know appropriate human contact. I've heard of a lonely man who would get his hair cut once a week just so that he would feel someone touch him. And what we need to realize here is that Jesus didn't need to touch him. Jesus could have healed him just by saying the word. He did it plenty of other times. But here he knows that he's meeting a man who's been starved of human contact for years. And so he stretches out his hand and touches him. One old commentator says about this passage that it was divine to heal him, but it was human to touch. It was divine to heal, but it was human to touch. And in Jesus we have both, the divine and the human, perfectly coming together. What other religion worships a God who will come down to this world, see a man who nobody wants anything to do with, and then stretch out his hand and touch him? But rather than becoming unclean by touching the leper, Jesus' touch makes the leper clean. Someone has said that nothing shows Jesus' goodwill towards us and his desire to save men and women than his readiness to come into contact with them. Nothing shows his goodwill towards us than his readiness to come into contact with us. Does that not describe Jesus' life on earth? I wonder, could the same be said about us? In the communities God has placed us in. We may genuinely care about the non-Christians around us, or at least we may tell ourselves that we do. But nothing will show them that, nothing will prove that to them as much as our being ready to come into contact with them. Yes, we pray for them, and that's vital, but they can't see our prayers. Jesus withdrew here to pray in verse 16, but he didn't do that instead of spending time with people. He didn't do that instead. He didn't do that as a way of avoiding contact with unclean people. So are we willing to welcome those who other people wouldn't? Those who others look down on? Those who may be very different from us in many ways? Jesus could have healed this man from heaven, but he came down. He could have healed him from a mile away. He could have stood beside him and just said the word. But he didn't. He touched him. Do you want to see people saved in this community? Well, if so, are you ready to be involved in the lives of those that our world would label unclean? Or are you going to demand that they clean themselves up first? Because if we're waiting for unclean people to clean themselves up first, we'll be waiting a long time. Now, we can't spend so much time with people that we never get alone with God. Jesus shows us that in verse 16, but that's probably not the danger for most of us. And if we're not spending the time alone with God that we should be, it's probably not because we're doing good things instead. When verse 16 says he would withdraw to desolate places and pray, it is a sense of something that Jesus would do frequently again and again. Jesus got the perfect balance between contact with sinners and contact with God. The increasing crowds, the unceasing demands on his time, the fact that no one else could do what he did, None of it stopped Jesus spending long periods of time in prayer. He shows us the perfect balance between contact with sinners and contact with God. May He give us the grace to get this right balance too. I think of the sheer amount of people that Jesus came into contact with. Are we tempted to hide away? There are plenty of people around us who need the touch of Jesus. And if they don't receive it from us, who else are they going to receive it from? So Jesus isn't some distant deity. He's not some far-off God. He comes down and He touches. And His touch is electric. Both in what it would have felt like to someone who hadn't been touched for so long, and in its effect. Normally when someone touches someone unclean, they become unclean as well. But here things run in the other direction. Jesus' purity heals the unclean leper. If you've been standing there, you could have seen this man change in front of your very eyes. His clawed hands and feet turning into usable fingers and toes again. His hair and eyebrows growing back. Him blinking as his eyes open fully for the first time in years. His skin soft and supple from head to toe. You can almost hear the gasps of those standing around. And again, it's a picture of what Jesus will do spiritually for those who trust in Him. And what He begins to do from the moment we trust in Him. He will bring about a complete restoration of all that sin and Satan have stolen from us. So the healing was complete. It was immediate, but it was also verifiable. Jesus says, verse 14, "Go show yourself to the priest as Moses commanded." We read the instructions for that as they're laid down in Leviticus earlier. The death of Jesus would abolish the Jewish ceremonial law with all its sacrifices and so on, but only after Jesus had perfectly fulfilled it on our account. So Jesus tells them to go to the priest to fulfill the law, but also as a proof to them. Unlike much so-called miraculous healing today, real divine healing is verifiable. It has nothing to fear from official scrutiny. Everyone can see that something amazing has happened. It doesn't have people coming back or coming away saying, "Well, I think I am a wee bit better, maybe I'll come back next week just to be sure." The healing was complete, immediate, verifiable. And it was also, and above all, to be a proof to the religious establishment that the true Messiah had come. They could no longer claim to be ignorant of who Jesus was, because He was doing exactly the sort of thing they should have expected the Messiah to do. As Jesus would reply to the messengers from John the Baptist a couple of chapters later, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." And yet the religious leaders of Jesus' day would be offended by Him, as we'll see in these next sections of Luke, as there's growing opposition to Jesus. And they weren't doing that out of ignorance, because Jesus was doing exactly what the Messiah was meant to be doing. And so Jesus cures the incurable and He touches the untouchable. And do we see that above all at the cross? This parable really sums up all that Jesus came to do. The holy and clean one came to this leprosy-infected, this sin-scarred world. He didn't stand at a distance giving advice, but He lived among us. The only pure one living among the rotting, walking dead. And then the hands that were stretched out in love to the leper will be taken and violently nailed to a cross. There he would face not just a gruesome physical death, but he would bear the curse of our leprosy, our sin. The one who came and stood alongside us would now push us to safety and stand in our place. Why? So that we could be clean, so that we could spread the message of the cure to those around us, and that he might be glorified. Amen. Well, let's praise the Saviour who bore the taint of our leprosy with the words of Psalm 77. Who indeed bore all our sin and guilt and shame. Psalm 77, the first two verses on page 168 and then 9 to 11 on page 169. Here we have in verse 2 someone who has been waiting a long time for God to intervene. Someone who might have wondered, verse 7, whether God had forgotten him. But then we sing in verse 9 about God's wonders. And again in verse 10, God is the one who works wonders. He heals broken people and broken communities. What a marvelous thing it would have been to see God healing someone whose life had been dominated by leprosy for so long. And what an even greater thing it is to see Jesus saving those whose lives have been dominated by sin for so long. And notice we sing in the first line of verse 10 that God is most holy. But that holiness didn't keep him distant from sinners, and it shouldn't for us. Then finally in verse 11 we sing of his arm. And in Jesus we see the arm of God come and touch a leper. And today he calls us to do the same and to do it in his name. So Psalm 77 verses 1 to 6 and then 9 to 11, if you're able, we'll stand to sing praise.